1 Thessalonians 1 and verse number 9. 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 9. And notice here that Paul says, "For they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God." Probably a reference to the Greeks, right? Probably a reference to those who are following in these other pagan religions. And there's almost, I saw one writer, one commentator who suggested, maybe there's even this idea that they're searching out something besides their pagan religion. Maybe they finally had enough with these, little statues that sit in their house, or these little things that they're praying to, or the things they have to do. Maybe somebody says, this doesn't make sense to me. I'm looking for something else. And so I turn from serving idols to the true and living God, coming out of the pagan religions, coming out of the Greek kind of way of thinking, and then turning to. So it's a mixed congregation of different folks, not all Jews. And of course, a lot of these congregations are going to be that, but it's certainly worth mentioning as we get into what Paul is going to say. This is a young congregation. All right, we're going to talk about the date in just a moment if we have time. We're going to talk about the date of this epistle, but by young, I mean it's not been established for very long when Paul is going to write this epistle. Not that it's all made up of 20-year-olds or whatever number you want to pick out to call young, but it's probably or possibly less than 2 years old when Paul is going to write this epistle to them, by the way that we can count time from Scripture and things. And think about this. The date, we're going to get here in just a minute, but the date is usually the early 50s, so 51, 52. So if we're counting backwards then to 0, and we're coming forward 33 or so years, we're talking about 20 years or so since Jesus has lived, died, and been gone. It's a young congregation overall, and a young congregation when Paul is going to write this epistle to them. That's going to play a part in what we know about them and maybe some of the things they're struggling with and the things they're going to, because this is not a bunch of folks who've been Christians for years or a congregation that was established 150 years ago like we have here in the United States or whatever. No, they're very new to this. And I kind of got off from my notes here, but the other thing I want to mention from Acts 17 is what you know about the rest of Acts 17 after the assault on Jason's house is that in verse 10, Paul and Silas go away to Berea, and there they meet some folks who are what? More fair-minded, right? Have you ever remembered from that who they're more fair-minded than? Right? Who this comparison is to? What do we say? We need to be like the Bereans, right? We need to be like the Bereans. They're searching the Scriptures. They're more fair-minded. That's right. But who's the lesser of this? What's the Thessalonians? Now, that's not to say that they're all bad people and that Paul is writing this letter because they won't study. But I mean, this is the comparison that's made. He finds people in Berea who are more fair-minded, who are searching the Scriptures. But it doesn't stop there. Notice in verse 13 of Acts chapter 17 that those annoying, difficult, troublemaking Jews follow him, right? It's not the end of it when after the assault on Jason's house and the bond is paid, they follow him. And do you know what follow him meant in this instance, right? In the first century? We're not talking about hopping on the train or getting in your car and driving over the mountain. I mean, maybe a day or two or more, boat, horse, camel, walking, I don't know. But they're following Paul and causing more trouble as he's going along on this journey. And it says there, the Jews from Thessalonica, verse 13, learned that the word of God was preached by Paul at Berea. They came there also and stirred up the crowds. How frustrating, right? How annoying would that have been? But yet Paul is having to deal with that. And so what he ends up doing, as we're going to talk about in the epistle, 1 Thessalonians, is he ends up sending Timothy back to them. And he's going to say that, what he says in the epistle is that Timothy has now come back to me, and he's given a report. Timothy's going to go back, and he's going to try to help them some, which sounds a lot like where we left off with our lesson last week. You remember all the way last week we were talking about the Great Commission, and we said that if you're going to clean the kitchen, you've got to do the dishes and sweep the floor and do all those things, right? And we said that if you're going to make disciples, you need to teach them the gospel, baptize them, but then also teach them again. And so what we see is not just the Great Commission set up that way, but we also see that Paul is living this out as best he can. Now what happens in Thessalonica is they grab Jason's house and they take him and they drag him off to the court. They make him pay the bond. And so Paul leaves secretly, right? He kind of has to get out of town. So this letter is a little bit of a, hey, I didn't get to do everything I wanted to do. I know you still need some encouragement. But it's also, I've sent Timothy back to check on you and to tell you some things, and he's come back and reported, and now I can write this epistle. I can share these things with you. And so it sounds a lot like what we've heard. The congregation was young. They still needed help. They still needed to be taught certain things. They were still going to struggle with some of this. And so that is just a little bit about the congregation here. We've just got about 10 minutes left or so here. Let me get to a few things that I called book basics then, about the epistle kind of itself. It's counted as one of the earliest. Now, if you've heard me already, you know that I despise a good scholarly argument more than just about anybody else, right? Because these scholars all think they know more than the previous scholar, and they'll spend all day arguing about, these things that maybe don't matter a whole lot in the end. But some people count James as the earliest epistle. Some people count Paul's earliest epistle as Galatians. All right, so if you were to go to Google and type in chronological order of the New Testament, you'll find a lot of pictures that show James, and I guess y'all are looking at me this way, James and Galatians here, and then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians right behind him. And I'm not telling you that I know and I want to argue about it, but it is one of the earliest that Paul would have written. So much so that he is still on the missionary journey. He is still traveling when he is going to write this and send back to them. I mentioned they're young. The congregation is new. It's young. He's also writing not long after that. Who was the author of the book of 1 Thessalonians? Well, if you've been to a Bible class before or ever studied the books of the New Testament, your answer is Paul. And I don't think you're wrong. If you're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 there, still have a page there, notice that it says Paul and Silvanus or Silas and Timothy is the way that it begins. Now, I'm not suggesting that Paul didn't write it. In fact, we agree on that. Not only does the internal evidence say that, but also what we call external evidence, which is early church writers who were not inspired, but who would sometimes record things. They would always say, Paul wrote this. And back to our scholar comment, it's not till like years later, that somebody finally says, I don't think Paul did that. And you're like, well, and they start arguing about it. But I did read a couple of folks who suggested that maybe Silas and Timothy played a little bit more of a part than we give them credit for sometimes. And it's just something interesting to kind of think about or kick around in your mind. 16 times, I think, between both epistles, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, at least 16 times you read the word we or us. Notice in chapter 2, if you're back in 1 Thessalonians, chapter 2 and verse 11. As you know how we exhorted. Verse 13, for this reason we also thank God. Verse 17, but we, brethren. Chapter 3 and verse 1, when we. And I didn't even write all the references down. I was just kind of pulling those out from memory and studying earlier. But you see that at least 16 times or so, we or us used. These three men were well known and well known to these people. And so I'm not saying that Paul, that they actually physically wrote some of it. We know ultimately God is the author, right? The Holy Spirit is the author, and so that's what we need to remember. But it is interesting that we sometimes treat Paul as if he might have been a lone worker or a lone wolf, But we see in his missionary journeys and even in his epistles, as he writes these, he had folks who were with him and encouraging him. Paul and Silas are in Thessalonica. Timothy goes back and visits and then comes back to Paul and reports. So they would have been as close as they could have been. And so I think it's interesting to think about that they may have had a bit of a part in this, or maybe they're together to some degree, but there is a connection. And I don't think we mean anything evil by it. We're not trying to be any kind of way, but it's easy to just always hold up Paul and sort of relegate Silas and Timothy in the same way that I think it's really easy to hold up Ephesians and Philippians and then think that 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are not very much, They're kind of short, and I don't understand them. I don't know what they're about, and I don't study them like we do Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. And so it's just a habit that I think we make sometimes, and it would help us to just think about all of this in context. So the date. Go back to Acts 17 for just a moment, actually Acts 18. Because in Acts 18, we get a clue as to when all of this would have taken place. In Acts chapter 18 and verse number 2, there is a mention of Aquila and Priscilla, right? This great couple that Paul meets and he's going to work with. But in a parenthetical phrase there, in verse number 2, you read a very short statement about Claudius, who had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. Well, from history, we know that Claudius's edict that he ruled down, this was supposed to take place, probably happened sometime in 51. And there's also over in chapter 18 and verse 12, a mention of Galileo, or not Galileo, but I'm mispronouncing it there, but this proconsul, who there's a mention there as well. And I was listening to one brother, and who'd was given a bit of a lecture on 1 Thessalonians, and this was one situation in which he mentioned that I believe this particular person was not really found throughout history for a long time. And so people are real quick to say then, well, he didn't exist. The Bible's wrong. This wasn't real. And it maybe took a while, but eventually in the unearthing process and all these artifacts, they find an archway, they find something, they find an inscription, and there's a mention of this particular guy here, and you can find it on the internet or find some of this and maybe even a picture of it idea, but that was around 52 that inscription is based back to. And of course, from other things, we kind of think that Paul may have been in Thessalonica on this second missionary journey around 50. So this is why I said a moment ago 2 years. 50 to 52 would have been both the time the church is established, and then Paul is moving on in his life and other travels, and then he's going to stop and write back to them. And you'll find folks who might debate you down to the day, but I'm not here to do that tonight. Real quick, one other thing from 1 Thessalonians. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 17. Another thing that kind of supports this idea that it wouldn't have been very long is the idea that Paul says here to them, 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 17. But we, brethren, having been taken away from you for a short time in presence and not in heart, endeavored more eagerly to see your face with great desire. So, short time is mentioned. But notice as well, verse 18, Paul makes a statement, we wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and again. So now we're back to kind of putting a little time between it, right? If he's had multiple times that he's at least wanted to go visit them, it's longer than like a month, right? So we don't want to quibble over days, but between a year or 2 years is when all this is taking place. It's very quick. Congregation established, a young congregation receives this epistle, and it's helpful for us to think about. This is very light here because we're going to run out of time, and I knew we wouldn't have much time. Depending on the preacher you want to talk to or the commentator you want to read, you can find anywhere between 1 and 8 different themes that go along with the book. But one of them that I liked was the idea that he was trying to help them learn how to live now in view of eternity. He's trying to teach them how to live now in view of eternity. What does that mean? Well, number one, it means they're probably dealing with persecution. He's going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to get there. We go through the chapters. But they're being persecuted. So he's trying to help them get through the moment with also thinking about eternity. If you're in 1 Thessalonians, here's another interesting thought that we'll maybe be able to kick around a little more later. Look in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse number 11. You probably heard it read before. But Paul says, 1 Thessalonians 4:11, that you may also aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, New King James, to work with your own hands as we commanded you. Now here's the one you know more. Go over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. I won't make Freddie say how many times he's told that to his kids or grandkids, but, right, we've all quoted that to people, to kids, right? You don't work, you're not going to eat. So you know that one before. But one of the thought process that comes out of this is that some of them may have had a problem in that they were misunderstanding, the second coming of Christ. And so some of them may have quit working. And they say, well, why would I work? Why would I waste my time here when Jesus is about to come back? The Lord's going to return again. And so he's telling them on at least 2 occasions in both epistles, you need to work. Working is a good thing. Working with your hands, working for yourself. The congregation's not here just to support you so that you can do nothing because you say Jesus is going to come back pretty soon. And one reason that we mentioned that, not just that, but the return of Jesus here, we're going to get to this. I don't know the best way to handle it, but I think Hiram Kemp say this several years ago, but as you look through both epistles, every chapter, at least one verse in every chapter deals with the second coming of Christ. And so it's an important topic. And they have some misconceptions about the resurrection. They've got some issues. One of those may have been, hey, we're going to do nothing and until, because it's fixing to happen. And so he is commending them. He's going to commend them for their faithfulness through the persecution, but he's got a lot to tell them. You're trying to live now in view of eternity, but you got things you need to know. And think back again, we've already mentioned it, but he left for Berea in a hurry. Kind of right in the middle of what he wanted to tell them, trying to help them grow, probably trying to help them learn all the things they needed to know to deal with this. He gets, the stuff with Jason happens, Jason's house, and he gets run out of town, has to leave, and so he's got to continue to encourage them. And I saw one person, I think it was the Bible Project. I think you've shown one of their videos before, but the Bible Project, if you've ever seen some of their videos online, they said that the book of 1 Thessalonians is this. It's Paul's attempt to reconnect to people he loved after a quick exit. That's a pretty interesting way to say it. Paul's attempt to reconnect to people he loved after a quick exit. You know what the problem is here? The problem is that we hold up Philippians as the book of joy and love, and we read it and we imagine Paul's tears falling down on the pages as he's writing because of how much he loved those brethren in Philippi. I think he loved the brethren in Thessalonica too, and you can see that in his writing. And he had to be taken away from them quickly because of the situation. And so he's going to want to try to attempt to reconnect with them and show them his love and give them his help, what he can encourage them with, while trying to make this, because he's not going to make it back. I mean, we already read it a moment ago. He said, time and again, I wanted to come back to you, but I just wasn't able to. And so this is the best I can do. I can send you not one, and as we know later, but 2 epistles to try to help you through all this persecution and this life that you're struggling with now. And correct you on some things maybe you're wrong about, and a few other things that we'll kind of get to. So I've got a lot of different sources I'm using, but again, we'll try to get some copies of Brother Roger's book to hand out to you maybe next week so you'd have them for the following week. But I appreciate your good attention and comments tonight.